When I wrote the abstract for the symposium, I was starting a new project called TERRA FORMA, but not the book, which I will talk during the coffee conversation a bit more, but a project developed by earth scientists to create environmental sensors in already well-equipped observatory of the critical zone. And I thank Ignacio for the introduction of the critical zone, which well done. And surprisingly, in this project, I'm involved as an architect cartographer. So this talk will be about terrestrial sciences, sensors, and lenses for understanding the Earth, as well as the creation of maps or new referential of maps. But it will also more about sharing thoughts than giving stable results. So the TERRA FORMA project is launched by the CNRS, it's a French national research, and it claims to be an observatory for the Anthropocene. But TERRA FORMA is not new, and it stems from a long history of observations and observatories. Indeed, TERRA FORMA Equipex, as they call it, amplifies the work beginning with the first project which networks the French critical zone observatories and which was called OSCAR, around instrumentation. So TERRA FORMA is in a way continuing the structuring of this research network and is also, it's a bit different, is territorializing the observatories more than the former project. So a few words on the definition of the critical zone, which is a notion referring to the Earth's habitable layer between the rocks and the skies. And the critical zone observatories are located in multiple locations around the world, in landscape or watersheds chosen as sentinel of environmental disturbances, to study water, soil, air, living organisms and their interactions, in which processes are studied at all timescales or timescapes. So critical zones observatories are highly instrumented places with sensors to monitor soil depletion, chemical water pollution, or biodiversity loss over the long term, and how these processes are coupled and interfere in our places of living. So this is not about a big event such as wildfires, but it's kind of a slow death of our environment. And the scientists there use geophysics, geochemistry, and biology and hydrology, and they, so for them, sensors are like windows or optics from which they observe, trace phenomena, but also collect significant amount of data that they store, share, analyze, and exchange. In this broader context, TERRA FORMA Equipex aims to develop a new generation of observatories equipped with frugal sensors and through which the involvement of stakeholders and civil society in the research process will be developed in a transdisciplinary approach. So TERRA FORMA offers also fields of study for social scientists for tracing these emerging sensors and studying a network under construction. 3 observatories are part of the TERRA FORMA Equipex project, a terrestrial coastal environment in Brittany, is the western part of France, a mountain landscape in the Alps near Grenoble, and an agricultural land in the south of France near Toulouse. And at the start of the TERRA FORMA project, as well as what I developed in my thesis, we are interested in the elements or entities of the environment, such as the forest, the soil, the air, or the river, and their becoming through monitoring practices in observatories. But whereas in my PhD on the critical zone, I was following scientists at work to understand how their practices lead to new understanding of the Earth, my mission in TERRA FORMA is more specifically oriented to create maps of observatories and their sensors, both existing and speculative. The ethnographic methodology involves long stays in the field, in the observatories, in outdoor setting, but also in laboratories, in indoor offices, where I can follow scientists at work, but also the sensors, the entities, and the phenomena. Both the project and the book, Terra Forma, share the same hypothesis. Thanks to new optics, lenses, or models, we could better describe the world in which we live, in particular the agentivity of entities, biotic or abiotic, that we used to take for granted as passive. To change our gaze, it's also necessary to use new optical instruments to see differently. And here we are also inspired by the work of Hooke, a scientist who invented the microscope and through which it impacts previously invisible worlds like the dust or the insects. And you see here the relationship between the instrument and the drawings of the scientific discovery. To introduce the critical zone observatory maps, I also need to go back a little bit to give you some background on why we started first to develop these maps. The starting point was actually a problem raised by the scientists themselves. They said, we cannot see the critical zone on a planetary scale, however important it is, because it's all where all life is living. Indeed, we cannot see the critical zone as a scale of the Earth as a planet, as it is a very thin layer on its surface. So this is the scale of the Earth and the critical zone. From the deep rocks to the lower atmosphere. But when we look at it from space, it's very thin and disappears from our view. So it appears kind of insignificant with the representation of the Earth, even though it is where all life developed thanks to the interactions of soil and air and water. And similarly, when we represent a critical zone by a cross-section or a block diagram, we miss also the planetary scale. So the visualization of the globe, in this visualization of the globe, the deep ground and the atmosphere, which remains a vacuum escaping into the distant space above the Earth, are excluded. So we suggest an inversion of the Earth layers in order to enclose the atmosphere in the middle. The rocks here are placed on the outer circle and the atmosphere on the inner circle. The Earth seems to have been turned inside out like a glove, and we don't map the surface, but we invert the gaze in order to visualize the layers of the subsurface and further down to the depth. Placing the atmosphere in the center reinforces the idea that there are terrestrial boundaries, that the pollutants that are released into the atmosphere, such as the CO2, the sulfur, the nitrogen, but also, as Gaston shows, the smokes, do not escape into the infinite universe, but remain there, trapped within the boundary of the planet. And the scientists are also studying how cycles terraform territories and how human activities disrupt them in ways that are sometimes unsuspected. So they are seeking to understand changes in biogeochemical cycles at specific sites across the Earth and how they manifest themselves on a global scale. If I have time later, I will explain how this grammar functions. But now, as I have set up the scenario, I have set up the scenario, and let's start with the question that the use of this mapping in the Terra Forma project may raise. So when I wrote the summary, I was a bit struggling with the sensors, the maps, the community, citizen science, politics, and my place in all of this, and so with the cosmopolitical. And then I read Jennifer Gabriel's book about sensors and how environments are actually created, are actually becoming or concrete, to borrow her term, by and through a network of practices, entities, devices, and more. And it kind of resonates with what I am experiencing with the fieldwork. Let's take this example of the River Lab. So what is the River Lab? So it's a tiny laboratory set up directly in the field. And inside, the machine records, as you saw in the drawing, you see in the drawing, sorry, they record the chemical variations. And by analyzing each chemical component at high frequency, with only a drop as the water of the river flows continuously inside the machine. So with this tiny amount of water captured and observed at high frequency, the scientists are able to trace several flows linked to each chemical element. So it is as if, in addition to the flow of water, there was a flow of sulfur, a flow of calcium, a flow of phosphorus, and so on. And not only water, but also chemical flows that can cause floodings. It is as if there were multiple rivers in the one we used to think as a unique flow. It's actually a pluriverse in the sense of William James' concept of multiple worlds. And I've heard dozens of stories like this, which not only make the entity water more complicated with agencies, but also creates an entirely new environment. Indeed, there is no background to uncover, but following Gabriel's, the way techniques, science, elements come together give us a different reading, understanding, and experience of the Earth. And what I experienced when I understood the River Lab, was an entire new cosmology to me. So the map of the observatory where this River Lab is operating, and that I will present now, attempts at visualizing this concrescence. So we made a little animation of this map, decomposing its process of making. So here we are in the critical zone observatory of the Strembach in the Vosges forest. It's at the border of the French-German. And I use a model I described previously with the atmosphere in the middle, and then we go deeper, we have the rocks. So I use this model in this fieldwork inside the critical zone in order to trace the various sensors that the scientists are deploying in the landscape. And these sensors gave us a new set of data to actually draw the map of the territory from the perspective of the critical zone. So here are the setup of the model. So you will see, and now we describe each view, each instrument that give a new understanding of the environment. So the geophones are a line of geophysics at the surface which probes the composition of the soil down to 100 meters. So vibration is triggered on the ground and their propagation is followed. And it reconstitutes the porosity of the soil at depth. And what's interesting is that it's a technique developed to explore for oil. Like many other instruments to explore the critical zone, it has been hijacked by scientists to accommodate the few meters of the soil, the near depth, as they call it, which is always in a dynamic state, eroding, weathering, showing the perpetual instability of the ground. Here we have the weather station. There are actually several devices recording the variations of the lower atmosphere and the direction of all elements carried by the winds. And the scientists are able to trace sulfur emissions from Asian industries that cause acid rain here when it crosses the Vosges forest in less than 20 days. So here we can have a vivid picture of the connectedness of the locations in the Earth, and with measurements also to assess this enclosure of the Earth we were talking about earlier, and the feedback of chemical elements from one territory to another. These atmospheric measurements of chemical elements are also assessed by instrumenting the trees, which are really sentinels of the environment. So areas of the forest are monitored to understand whether or not there is a resilience after storms, acid rain, pests, and the impact of the forest industry as well. And what I didn't realize was that the roots actually do something extraordinary deep down. They make an underground atmosphere that is completely mirroring what happens at the surface. In fact, they produce CO2, oxygen, and other gases, So it's as if there is one atmosphere on the surface and another in the depth. But unfortunately, this means not good news because more CO2 is stored in the soil than expected and will be released in the event of massive deforestation, as it is the case all over the world. There is also a gravimetric station, which is a machine more sophisticated, which records the signal from the water table at depth. But it is also so sensitive that it records other signals, such as the force of gravity of the tides breaking on the seacoast hundreds of kilometers away. So it's like echoes propagating to the continental forest. And here we go even deeper into what is going on in the soil, what is going on in the subsurface. And what we see that the Earth is connected actually in the subterranean. It vibrates, it echoes from place to place. Here you will see the core samples that are more conventional techniques. It extracts soil from deep underground, but it also exposes unsuspected pockets of water at depth. And the water, as you know, triggers chemical reactions in the rocks, possibly even allowing the presence of bacteria and microorganisms, which could actually represent a biomass superior to the surface, but is sometimes a biomass that is underestimated. So this kind of biomass defies our understanding of the biotic and abiotic processes as it is close to geochemical reactions. As Jennifer Gabriels writes in her book Program Earth, it's necessary to bypass an automatic understanding of sensors as detecting environmental data, as if there is a world out there with phenomena to be made visible. Instead, she argues, sensors, experiences, and entities actually concretize different environments and different milieus. That is, they enable particular environment to materialize. I hope that in the Schrember Critical Zone Observatory map, we can see the concretions of this deep atmosphere, the concretions of a pluriverse of rivers, and the connectedness of cycles reframing the terrestrial. And if we follow the argument, then, I quote again Gabriels, sense data are less descriptive simply of pre-existing conditions and more productive of new environments, entities, and occasions of sense that come to stabilize as environmental conditions of concern. As she analyzes, cameras in an equipped forest are sensors that generate environment of attention and concern, because also the result is easily readable with camera put in the forest. But in the case of critical zone sensors, the result is much more difficult to experience. The map is therefore an attempt to make the translation needed to understand how the sensor concretes new ecological relationships, and the map participates, I hope, in this concrescence, especially in all that relates to underground processes, and with the aim that these worlds also become objects of concern. It's not only a translation of sciences, sometimes people say vulgarization, as it is a territorial programmatization of terrestrial issues that need to be addressed in a particular framework, and which questions further the scientists and the public to which the map could be shown. Similarly, the other maps of the observatories that we are drawing now, the phenomena and the sensors in this TERRA FORMA project are an attempt to build these environmental objects of concern. For example, in the south of France, the issue is the agriculture and how agriculture destroys the soil. So the map asks how to visualize something that is missing, that is eroding and weathering continuously. Or in other setting in Brittany, the map asks where are the water paths at depth, how the subsurface and the surface relate in terms of chemistry and physics, because there is a big issue on water resources in Brittany. And the particularity here is that also scientists are interested in developing speculative maps based on socio-ecological modeling scenarios and presenting them to stakeholders. So these maps could be an exploration of speculative territories as seen through the particular instruments, the sensors, that measure environmental variables, but also question our relationship with the entities that compose the Earth. They aim to trace the emergence of these new environments, these new territories, this critical zone, that concrete through the sensors, the entities, the scientists, the actors of the territories, the particles, the microorganisms, the birds, and so on. And the position of the cartographer changed also in this approach. She is not placed in the middle, in the milieu of, she is now placed, in the middle, in the milieu of movements, changes, and dynamics, as there is a need to follow entities making up the ground, the soil, the rocks, but also the atmosphere we breathe. This map are also an attempt to shift the anthropocentric view by multiplying the view thanks to the instruments, sensors, and the knowledge of the scientists and inhabitants, and to construct the map around this multiple view. I wish now to go back to the difference between the Earth and the critical zone. So the maps of the critical zone and its sensors are in fact the opposite of the satellite view, which offer a global, unified observation as if the Earth were a single object unifying a single world. On the contrary, the environmental sensors distributed across the multiple locations of the critical zone offer multiple dynamic views of the Earth, but this also means that climate change is not a single world in crisis, which will justify a single way of acting or a single solution, but that there are multiple effects that the sensors help to trace. We could argue that this multiplicity of ways of seeing, viewing, experiencing the Earth will create a more cosmopolitical approach in our ways of dealing with socio-environmental issues. Critical zone sensors mobilize multi-located and multifocal processes of seeing and are beginning to integrate multi-specific ones too, because I didn't elaborate on the new maps with the TERRA FORMA project, but in the TERRA FORMA project there are more sensors about the organisms than there were in the critical zone observatory, the former project. But for sure, in the critical zone observatory, there is already a cosmopolitical way of creating science and data because the disciplines mobilized in each observatory must coexist, even if there are sometimes very, very different practices between a geophysicist and a geochemist, for example. And to finish, I will put in perspective a map of a life point of the tree that we made complementary to the soil map in the Strembar Critical Observatory. In order to make the parallel with more insight from Gabriel's book, and as she quoting Whitehead, for who we are in the world and the world is in us. And in this map, we, the cartographer and the scientist, consider the trees as sensors, as sentient. Remember, as they experience also chemistry from the air through the rain. And so the trees also measure, experience, and concrete worlds. So this is another model to map the micro and macro world as the cosmology of a tree, not a general or a conceptual tree, but a tree living in the Vosges forest in this observatory that I described previously. And we've mapped how the tree brings the world into being. We've traced its different terrains of life from the soil and its relationship with underground communities that you can see on the outer edge of the map, to its bark, so it's different circles going through the centers, and in the center it's a world. So we have this different, let's say, scale of life terrain, the forest, the watershed, the continents, and with the continents, the winds that carry nutrients from cement plants or the sands of the Great Desert, which sustain actually the tree. And the tree also creates the world by releasing oxygen and absorbing CO2, as breath is an example of the difficulty involved in delineating where the body ends and the world begins, as captured by Whitehead. And this tree, a spruce actually, is threatened by drought, beetles, in its different envelopes. And the tree, as you see with the map, and also in the critical zone observatory, has a capacity to measure in the sense of experience and concrete the environment. It converges with Gabriel's ideas of, I quote, bodies as ways of making measurement possible as a distinct experience and mode of individuation. If rather than see the relationship of monitoring instruments as a transparent rendering of data, or alternatively as a mere construction, we instead regard it as a process of selecting, experiencing, and compressing worlds, then an expanded repertoire of measurement practices might also emerge. And similarly, the Terra Forma project further asks, what is a sensor? What are the variables to measure, and for which worlds? The measurements of the tree capture the connectivity of events. The map that we continue to develop with the psychers and with the geochemists also attempt to create new measurements to capture the connectivity of earthly processes through cycles. I will not develop here because of the time, but just to say that it contributes to the same movement at generating alternative coordinate systems more attuned to the terrestrial timescapes and the connectedness of Earth fluxes, fluids, and rocks. And thank you.